Thank you, Michael. Thank you all in the audience for joining us. Thank you to my panelists for coming today. This should be a fascinating discussion, to say the least. And the title for today, Decarbonizing the Hard Way, you might recognize it. It's a bit of a homage to Amory Levin's the Rocky Mountain Institute, who wrote a famous 1976 foreign affairs essay about the hard path in terms of energy use and the soft path. And the soft path, he argued then, would be one that basically took us towards a path of renewables, towards basically gradually decarbonizing our economy and avoiding some of the intractable issues of climate change that we have today. And of course, the United States took the hard path. It also refers to the fact that, that if you may have seen today's news report that, basically global carbon emissions fell 17% in April versus the year before, which of course has two caveats. This unprecedented drop basically dropped the world to just 2006 levels of carbon emissions. So it also goes to show how much growth has happened in the last decade and a half. And also the fact that, we only had to wreck much of the world's economy to achieve that. It also underscores just how much further we would have to go to actually achieve any of the scenarios outlined by the Paris Accords to achieve the minimum rise of 2 degrees centigrade that would be needed to stave off catastrophic climate change. And the bad news goes from there in some ways, because of course that 17% drop cannot last. The world is beginning to reopen, particularly in the West. And we're seeing these changes when it comes to cities. There's already a consensus sort of brewing in the United States. Reports coming out of New York, anecdotally, of New Yorkers rethinking their lives about living in dense urbanism and relying on public transportation if they don't want to be under lockdown or they can't trust the subway. Should they be buying cars? And I bring this up, of course, because the International Energy Agency has pointed out that the second largest source of carbon emissions over the last decade was not just the purchase of cars, but the purchase specifically of SUVs and other large formats. So we can sort of see, I keep thinking these days about Robert Frost's poem, Fire and Ice. Some believe the world will end in fire, others believe it will end in ice. And I think of course, fire as the climate change and ice as the sort of lockdown. And, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But on the plus side, of course, we also know that this year, recent statistics have come out that in the United States, at least, this will be the first year that renewables will outpace coal. And we also know, for example, that that the IEA is once again revising its solar energy production figures. Ramez Nam, who's with Singularity University, one of the biggest boosters of solar panels over the years, has acknowledged that even his most optimistic scenarios for the last 10 years have failed to keep pace with the actual rate of solar installation. So, at the same time that we're seeing, this potential change back to a lifestyle that would favor more sprawl and favor land use against this, the actual technology itself continues to improve. Now, it's also been noted that, that behind COVID-19, that really this is just sort of a warm-up for the longer-term impacts of climate change. And I keep thinking about the fact that, climate scientists have already warned that this year is shaping up in the Atlantic, at least, to be the most hyperactive, their words, hurricane season since 2005. And of course, you remember 2005 was the year of Katrina. So there is, of course, a lot to do in thinking about once we emerge from this immediate crisis, how do we then begin to tackle the longer-term one? So with that, I think hopefully that's enough preamble here to set up with my excellent panelists with their excellent Zoom backgrounds. I hope Room Reader drops by to get Kathy's bookshelf and Billy's excellent virtual background, and Charles Edouard and I will just have to suffice. But with that, I'd like to, begin with opening questions here. We can go to Brady Bunch view anytime now. I'd like to set up my first question for Charles Edouard, who's with Tractebel Engie, a very large, formerly state-owned French energy giant. And of course, Charles Edouard, I was hoping you could talk a bit about, as a way of framing things, about some of the technologies and the adoption in cities that gives us cause for optimism in terms of how we can use this as a moment of opportunity to begin decarbonizing our cities by deploying, these new arrangements of solar panels, microgrids, et cetera, et cetera. So Charles Edouard, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg, and good morning, or good afternoon, and even good evening to everyone. That's really a pleasure for me to be here, and as you said, with very good other panelists. So, first of all, a bit of background. As you said, I'm coming from a company which purpose, I would say, is to be a world leader in zero carbon transition as a service. So I think that we are speaking, I would say, the same language when it comes to renewable energy. Of course, we have a lot of technologies. And what I would say or highlight is that today, at least from my point of view, the debate should not be or not only on technology. To put it simple, I think all the technologies exist. The question is how to accelerate the implementation And about that, we have always to think about different levels of stakeholders, different kind of stakeholders, different scales of geographies, what we can call as governance. So what, if I may rephrase your question, is what or which governance should we have in order to accelerate the development and implementation of renewable energies, including the link between production on the one hand, and there we find all the so-called renewable energies, so solar, wind, geothermy, biogases as well, huh? Not only thinking about electricity, and on the second hand, distribution, and therefore the link between production, consumption, what we can call between offer and demand. And there we speak about smart grids or smart multi-energy grids. I would say, again, it's always a combination between technologies, between energies. And the difficult question is about governance. So when we speak about local and renewable energy, we speak about local stakeholders and not only national ones or even international ones. We speak about public and private, not only public or private. It's always a combination between the two. And as you know also, the public should have an S. We have different public entities as well as we have different private entities. And all in all, we need also to serve some end clients, which themselves are also becoming active in an energy system. We speak about prosumers, as you may know. Mm-hmm. So it's always a combination, I would say, about technology, stakeholders, governance, and technology exists. The key question is how to accelerate the implementation.
Well, yes. So my question is part of that acceleration then? We've seen, for example, that coal is, of course, rapidly falling out of use case in the United States and elsewhere. There's precipitous decline in both coal employment. I just saw that stat today, et cetera. How do we continue to leverage this to continue the shift to renewables? I mean, natural gas for years, for example, was touted as a bridge. We know now that we can't really use natural gas in mass if we want to achieve our climate goals. So what are the kinds of arguments you're making to customers that the time is right, the economics are right to make a shift en masse to solar or wind, et cetera, at this particular moment? Why this should be an opportunity to change over their portfolio even faster than before?
I think we can highlight 2 points. The first one is about the price. I would say the competitiveness between energies that are in a way in competition, or of course we can debate about the current price of oil, which is always very important in all debates on energy, of course. Mm-hmm. But I would say that the massive development, recent development of renewable energies has shown that the price is very competitive. And specifically when we speak about long-term, the total cost of investment, including OPEX. So the first highlight would be, I would say, on competitiveness. And the second one, I think very important, is about the political will. And this is what I think is at stake. Again, it's not about technology, it's about governance, it's about political willingness to develop things. And political willingness is, again, at different scales. Local scales, usually it's working well. People are getting elected at local scale. They know their, let's say, population, and they know their territory. National scale is always a bit more difficult. And of course, international scale is always difficult. And what we see with the current crisis is that, again, we have to mix the different scales. What should be always key is political willingness to develop things in order, I would say, to conciliate the planet on the one hand, and if I may say, capitalism on the second hand. So I think this is maybe going to another debate then, but this is really the political willingness of political decision makers is very important. And I think we can also highlight the different green deals that we see. So I'm based personally between Paris and Brussels. So I see a lot what is happening in the European Commission or European geography. And I hope that things will really evolve in the right direction, not only I would say in Europe, but everywhere in the world. And maybe we can also ask to our other colleagues what they see in other geographies, but I'm pretty confident that we will be able to continue to transform the energy reality, at least in Europe, because again, we have a good political willingness and the technology exists and are competitive.
Excellent, thank you. This is a perfect point to transition, or this is my cue to actually interject as for our bingo cards. You know, your choice of Paul Romer's "A Crisis is a Terrible Thing to Waste," or Milton Friedman's "In a Crisis, People Seize Ideas Lying on the Ground." And yeah, my next two panelists, I think, can discuss this. So first, I would like to address a question then to Kathy Bowman-McLeod, who is the director of the Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Center for Resilience at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Kathy recently wrote her own article for Foreign Affairs, looking basically at sort of market-based solutions and insurance and other measures that how to sort of capture financial markets to sort of, fund both decarbonization, but also climate adaptation. And this is important because I failed to add as part of my framing documents that, yes, that the money printer going burr has not gone burr fast enough when it comes to global stimulus. And, in the United States context, for example, there has not been a bailout of cities and the states. And so there's a question of like, how will we pay, to go back to that debate in US politics, how will we pay for it? So Kathy, I'd like to hopefully hear your thoughts first on how will we pay for these mechanisms to further invest in decarbonization and the kind of measures necessary to harden our coastlines and also invest in the kind of resilience our cities need.
Thank you very much, Greg. I'll take the question as how we decarbonize. I'll use decarbonize in a general way, not the literal way, given the fact that we're focused on climate adaptation. We've accepted the state of affairs that has temperatures where they are today and storms forming before the season and temperatures of 108 in Phoenix in early May. I mean, all of those things that we all know. And that means in terms of infrastructure, and I would love to put an emphasis on natural infrastructure, that we can't afford not to invest in these things. And when you look at the underlying vulnerabilities of people living in cities that have reduced access to healthy food and polluted water and polluted air, we are more vulnerable than ever to something like a pandemic, particularly a respiratory disease when we have asthma from pollution that's legal. So we have some really underlying issues around inequity, just thinking about who does decarbonizing impact and where. And then when you think about investment and a recovery, one of the things you'll note in a lot of the wonderful messaging from leaders like Kristalina Georgieva and others of the institutions, the IMF and from the EU, is that these green recovery packages, we have to have the green, but what is, how do we include health and where our ability to build and maintain cities that have access to and the ecosystem benefits provided, ecosystem services provided by nature, if we don't have them and we don't do that equitably, we won't benefit from the decarbonizing efforts and the great news of renewables overtaking coal in this year. And so we've got some really hard thinking and changing the way we value what we would say investment is, because we've got to incorporate those bits that are and they're so much more than bits. They are currently externalities. They need to be internalities when we think about it. And so I'll stop there. There's lots to talk about, but that's a little bit of our perspective. And just to note from the Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center at the Atlantic Council, which there is a quiz afterward. I want to hear everybody say it 3 times in a row, that we have set a goal of reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions. And so we work very closely with cities around the world to bring solutions on the ground for climate, migration, public health, and things like that. And so we're looking very carefully at the financial system and thinking about the before COVID-19, fewer than 4% of cities in the developing world that are creditworthy. And so thinking of investment in that context is sometimes a little far-fetched. We've got a lot of work to do. So anyway, thanks for having me today.
No, thank you, Kathy. I would say we'll come back to that, particularly, given Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller is sort of the inheritor of the 100 Resilient Cities program of Rockefeller. So talking about what the future of resilience officers look like and how cities can embed that expertise. So we'll come back to that. But I want to go to Billy because, the invocation of Green New Deal obviously brings us to Billy Fleming, who is the Wilkes Family Director at the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Billy is one of the foremost advocates of an aggressive Green New Deal in his work there, and also at Data for Progress, the progressive polling group. And so Bailey, you recently wrote a piece for Jacobin sort of arguing why we need a green stimulus, why we need something at the measure of the Green New Deal. And yeah, I was hoping you'd sort of lay out your vision of how, the United States, but also globally, we would implement that and pay for it and seize this moment.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us. First of all, it's great to see everyone, and especially see so many people over the world on here for this conversation. I can't believe you don't all have Zoom fatigue like I do. I'm like struggling to look at the screen for this long. There's a couple things there. So one is, I think, sort of detached from the moment, and one is very much about the moment we find ourselves in. And I'll be as brief as I can, because I want to get into Q&A and have some conversation. But on the sort of detached from the pandemic moment, Green New Deal conversation, I think like the idea itself still very much has a lot of meat to be filled in on the bones of what a G&D could or should be. But I think at the core of it, like understanding that any approach to climate change that even begins to tackle it at the scale at which it is occurring will be necessarily radical. So any pragmatic Green New Deal will itself be radical, and any sort of pragmatic solution to climate change will have to be that way as well. But I think within this moment of thinking about whether it's within the US, whether it's within other sort of Western or global North nations, or whether it's in the global South, thinking about like filling the hole in the economy that COVID-19 has created is a huge part of this conversation. So thinking about a stimulus that's right-sized to the gap that we're in. I think to Kathy's point about the infrastructure side of this, that tends to be where I focus. I'm a landscape architect and a city planner, so I tend to think about the built in the natural environment more than I think about other things. And so I say that as like a preface to what's probably a little bit of bias here, but there tends to be a kind of overemphasis on like the electrons and the molecules of climate change, the electricity and the carbon molecules. And while those things are like hugely important, I think to Charles's point, like most of the tech is there for us to figure out how to do this. This is a deployment and financing problem, not a technical problem for most things. There are obvious exceptions like air travel and steel and other heavy industry sectors that we don't know how to decarbonize. But for the most part, we know how to decarbonize the rest of the sort of sectors. And so as we put together, I mean, you've referenced the Jacobin piece. That piece is referencing a letter that we delivered to members of Congress about 2 months ago now called a Green Stimulus to Rebuild Our Economy. Has like 5,000 people who've signed on, and they run the gamut from climate activists like Naomi Klein and Bill McKibben to Gina McCarthy to all kinds of other folks who are, I think, much more within the kind of establishment climate world. And in that, we sort of laid out the case for a few things that we think, that I think are vital to whatever our response is going to look like to this, our sort of total response. One is that any stimulus is probably going to have to come with stabilizers, automatic stabilizers. So this is the idea that you basically set benchmarks which continues to go until those benchmarks are hit. So if it's unemployment, if it's total decarbonization, that some percentage of GDP in each nation is automatically directed towards things like parks and civic infrastructure and transportation and all kinds of other things until we've met whatever those goals are. Another is around a sort of sectoral focus. So the letter itself, the piece in Jacobin you referenced, the piece I just had come out yesterday in the LA Review of Books on a similar topic, is sort of making the case that there's a need for a sectoral based approach to this. That's where a lot of technology has been commercialized. It's where a lot of the sort of aspects of this are really felt by people in their everyday lives. So whether that's in housing or the building industry on its own, whether that's in transportation alone, whether that's in public land and parks and civic infrastructure alone, whatever it might be, that tends to be the way that I tend to think about how we might think about designing a stimulus. And I'll just sort of wrap up by saying, one of the things we sort of hold with us in this moment are the lessons from the various failures that played out all over the world in 2009 during the Great Recession. Certainly in other countries, but especially here in the United States, where even with a supermajority in the Senate, even with a huge majority in the House, and even with a Democrat in the White House, we still really only got one bite at the apple. We got the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. Famously was kept under $1 trillion because people, including Larry Summers, who's now involved in advising Joe Biden's campaign, felt that $1 trillion would just be politically impossible to sort of pass through the sort of voting public. We can kind of see now in the last few weeks how laughable that is, because we've already spent on orders of magnitude or several times larger than that. We're going to spend a lot more. But that bill itself was too small, did too little, and was geared too much towards the sort of the 1% of the U.S. And so I think we have to hold with us this idea that whatever stimulus comes, when it's time to go back to work post-pandemic, it's going to have to be much larger. Hopefully it's going to include stabilizers so that Congress or legislative bodies don't have to come back to the table every few months to sort of hash out a new deal over a new bailout or stimulus package. And it's going to have to focus on sectors. It can include things like carbon molecules and electrons and electricity, but ultimately people will understand and experience those kind of investments, not by flipping on a switch in their room and noticing that it's powered by wind instead of coal, because who the hell would ever know that? But they're going to notice when they get deep energy retrofits in their house. They're going to notice when their commute to work is on a low or no carbon train or bus, or an electric vehicle that they could purchase at half price because the tax credits have been tuned up so much. Those are the ways in which the material benefits of the stimulus can actually reach a swath of people. And that's where I sort of hope, we land in a few months when this thing starts to sort of become in our rearview mirror.
Thank you, Billy. That was excellent. I just want to pause for a moment to tell the audience in about 10 minutes or so, we'll start opening it up to audience Q&A. So please, as Michael said at the top of the call, put your questions in the Q&A and upvote them, the ones you want to see presented to our panelists. But I want to go back to Charles Edouard and Kathy here, because most of what we've talked about, to some extent, I think Kathy touched upon some of the locality of it, but both Billy and Charles Edouard talking about both the tech and the big picture policy of stimulus are both way up here at the federal level. And let's bring it back to cities, because of course we are new cities and this is a cities discussion. So maybe Kathy, we could start first and then Charles Edouard, but going back to what I was mentioning about the resilience officers, how do we ground this conversation in cities, or how can cities take the lead on this? Because a lot of the fiscal issues are beyond their control, with the exception of, United States municipal bonds and some other issues. But, how is the role of the resilience officer evolving to tackle this particular moment, the health resilience, the, decarbonization and climate aspects of this all together in one with part of the crisis? Are cities internalizing this skill set, and how can they possibly lead on this?
Yes, they are internalizing the skill set, and I will give great credit to the Rockefeller Foundation and the 100 Resilient Cities program for the legacy they left of the movement to build resilient strategies, to take what is complex, complicated, and oftentimes result in 900 different stakeholder meetings in a community to understand what are the threats and what are we going to do to address those threats and how will we pay for it. And that's hard work. The Global Resilient Cities Network is the another legacy and sister organization to our organization that continues to connect and share information on resilience and strategies across the network of 90 plus cities in that 100 Resilient Cities network, and they're our close partner. I think the best way to show it is to tell a story of the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, and when asked, they needed to build a 2,000 bed hospital in New Orleans for COVID-19 patients. They saw the numbers and they knew what they were going to have to do, and they didn't have the capacity. And because of the practice they had through Katrina and every other crisis they've experienced, and the Resilient Cities exercise to build the strategy, they built the hospital in 4 days. And it's because they had the muscle built of resilience. And so resilience planning and strategies work. You need money and you need political leadership to execute them, but that is undoubtedly a fact that's coming to bear as cities are dealing with, and I think about the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County and Miami Beach facing hurricane season, heat, mosquito-borne illness, COVID-19, you name it. And you've got to be nimble, you've got to be ready to figure out how you're going to pay for it. And so one of the things I'd love to come back to is the risk and finance aspects of resilience and how we get more sophisticated about really understanding those risks and getting ready to finance them.
Absolutely. I would definitely want to come back to that. But first, Charles Edouard, I'm curious what your conversations with cities have been like on this, and also, again, how to structure these investments, right? You mentioned, the notion of sort of as a service, getting beyond just simply buying large investments in capacity and power plants and peakers, et cetera. What originality have you seen in cities as a part of, thinking about how, again, to increase their resilience overall in the face of COVID, but also particularly about, again, using this particular moment as they face these financial challenges, about how they can quickly, rapidly, amortize and depreciate their investments in fossil fuels and make those investments into clean energy, et cetera?
So this is an excellent question, and again, this is maybe the most difficult but also interesting part, which is about how to implement or to accelerate. So I would say I would highlight a few points. First of all, I said before that technology exists. I would say projects exist. where we have, or we put, I would say, some technologies. Maybe highlighting a few examples around your geography. We have been working in project with Ottawa, probably some of you know, in the US, in Iowa University or Ohio State University as well. So not only with cities or municipalities, but also with other kinds of districts or cities or part of cities. Recently, we have been working in opposite side of the globe in Australia, in a very nice project in Springfield. It's a suburb of Brisbane.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that the projects that do exist again, and what would be the magical recipe in those projects? I think it's always a question of first political willingness to have someone responsible for something, being bold, being clever, being visionary, and willing to create an impact, not only to copy paste what we are used to do since decades, I would say, to put a big power plant somewhere, and then we speak about this transmission and distribution of either gas or electricity or even heating. So this is the first thing I would say is about political willingness. Again, I already spoke a bit about that. And linked to that, I think what you do is very important to let people discuss, to increase the level of interactions. If I, the mayor of Ottawa, I have had a very good idea, why not sharing that with the rest of the world? And also explaining the issues that I face and also the solutions that I have found. So this is the first point about political willingness and vision. The second one, I would say, is about not only the dialogue between public bodies, but also with the private sector. And I think we don't have we have to accelerate that. It's not a taboo to work when you are public to work with the private, or when you are in a private to work with the public. It's always a combination about ideas, a question about business models, as we say in the private sector, and about governance, as we say more in the public sector. So when we speak about other service, we always come back to this kind of PPP models, where in fact we have a lot of PPPs and models, one of them being concessions, but we have in fact a lot of possibilities, and of course which have to be fine-tuned locally, of course at national scale, but also sometimes at a more local and city scale. So this is, I think, the most important things is to discuss, is to interact, is to debate, is to share, is to learn from each other. And maybe to finish on that, what is always also difficult is to be able to copy paste something which is coming, I would say, to the right direction. So it's always easy to copy paste what we are used to do since decades. It's much difficult to copy paste what we are just starting to do somewhere in the world. So how to help share more? Again, the projects are already existing, the technology are existing, political willingness and vision always critical, and then the more we will interact, the better it will be for everyone.
Excellent, thank you. Well, back to the political will question, I want to come back to Billy on this and draw upon your work on the side at Data for Progress, which, you know, in addition to drafting excellent plans on what to implement and how, there's also continuous polling that shows that a Green New Deal is, of course, very popular. And so that comes back to my question. So referencing Amory Lovins from 1976, we knew the path we needed to take. We knew that it made financial sense. For years, he's made the case, among many others, that it is financially more prudent to invest in clean tech and do these kinds of investments than it is to continue on this path, and yet never been able to convince elites at the very least, and then perhaps the voters under it. So Billy, I'm curious if any insights from your latest work on Data for Progress in the wake of COVID-19 about what messages resonate inside, for example, the Biden campaign with the presidential elections here, and you know, with the American populace in particular, since that's Data for Progress's rubric.
Sure. I mean, I should say initially, or I should say outright that, like, I remain very skeptical about the ability of just like producing big data and findings to like convince to perform elite persuasion.
Of course.
You know, years and years have shown there are very real limits to that. But look, like there aren't a lot of like ardent free market capitalists or neoclassical economists in a crisis like this. Suddenly everyone is at least like socialist curious, and everyone is at least like MMT or heterodox economic curious, because the moment demands alternatives to the sort of conventional wisdom that has brought us to this point. And there's lots we could say about that. I mean, you can go through the polling and find there's been Green New Deal specific polling that's come out through DFP showing just like a surge in public support for it. Not a big surprise. People are clamoring for big ideas and sort of real large material benefits to themselves and to their friends and families and communities at this moment. The same is true for a bunch of the provisions you can find in the Green Stimulus Letter. A bunch of polling just came out actually last week on that. But I think like one of the most important things to remember here, which I think Charles Edouard and Kathy are both sort of pointing to, is that we need like a little bit of institution building here. If we think about like the ecosystem of policy development, of implementation, the deployment, development of technology, I think imagining those things as like happening in one space and not the other is always kind of a foolish way to frame these. That actually like over time, all of those things tend to interact and produce all of the things. We're all on a laptop or a phone right now, almost every component of which has been developed by ARPA, DARPA, some other sort of industrial policy institution in the US or abroad. And so I think a lot of the most interesting conversations right now are happening around that institutional piece about how you channel public and private investment, and in the US especially, how you actually build something like a legible and not ad hoc industrial policy that can allow you to steer investment towards specific national goals like clean or renewable energy, which we actually don't have right now. We have ARPA-E on the books. A lot of people forget it was authorized but not appropriated or funded by the George W. Bush administration. The first round of funding did not hit it until the 2009 stimulus bill was passed. And so, you know, you can go through and find like the trillions and trillions of dollars being channeled by the Fed into a number of different markets. We're going to need other ones that can focus on channeling private and public investment into infrastructure and housing and all kinds of other things, into sort of channeling investment into renewable energy, not just like development, but deployment. And in thinking, you know, again, about how we sort of manage this process of a sort of rapid or fast path to net zero in our cities and communities. And I want to just really quickly point back to New Orleans and Katrina that Kathy brought up just a moment ago, because if you remember, 2005, the sort of, in addition to the disaster itself, like the rollout of the relief and recovery process itself was quite stunted and quite a problem. Lots of reasons for that. One is that they had no ability to manage the billions of dollars coming into the city or the state after Katrina, which led to all kinds of problems, including corruption and their former mayor going to jail and all kinds of other things. One of their responses, which was quite smart, was to develop the Coastal Protection and Recovery Agency. I think you get that right, CPRA, CPRA, or Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, and thinking about how they could develop an institution that might not be funded at quite the level they want, that might be empowered in quite the way they wanted it initially, but that could grow over time and become a force for sort of steering Louisiana's climate policy in the right direction. We're going to need all kinds of those things at the national, state, and local level as well, if we're going to steer this stuff long term. And I think, you know, I'll just say lastly, looking back at the New Deal, which is the central reference of the Green New Deal, where all kinds of institution building took place, even in a time economy, even at a time when we had all kinds of public investment being channeled through the levers or the organs of the federal government at the time. They still created these kinds of institutions on the side to channel private investment, many of which lasted far longer than the political coalition that made the New Deal possible. They weren't fully dismantled until the 1980s. And I think we're entering a period in which we're going to have to build a bunch of new ones attuned to the challenges of climate change.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Kathy before we open up into audience Q&A. You know, I think we've discussed the tech exists, the political willingness exists, the electorate exists, and the money exists somewhere. And Billy touched upon, some of the stimulus and quantitative easing that's been happening as part of this. But I want to come back to your comment about risk and finance in this, Kathy, and obviously you're the financial expert here. You know, large-scale institutional investors are willing to pour billions of dollars into areas where they believe that there's a possible long-term return, and they are very willing to make long-term bets, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years. So I'm curious, you know, if Billy's made the case here about how we can basically sort of channel some of the federal money that's coming out of this, you know, in the stimulus, what's your prescription of like how cities can do a better job of basically tapping into the private finance streams? I know, for example, that Miami, because it makes investments in resilience, has a better bond rating than many other cities. And so it can tap into that. I'm curious here, what sort of innovations do you think are possible there to sort of start tapping into the private funds?
Well, you're right. There is plenty of money. That's not the issue. When you think about the products that are available, I want to put some of the risk transfer products into the picture. It's not just long-term financing, but it's also behooves a city to fully understand their risks. And it's a complex landscape, but to understand fully what are our risks and what are we willing to hold and what can we afford to push to the private market, or can we access institutional funding to help us manage risk and access to capital. And thinking about some of those products, you know, in the developed world, we've seen the city of Miami had a $400 million bond that has a lot to do with the community having an understanding of what those risks are. They know that sea level rise is fundamentally, it's happening every day and it's coming up through the storm drain. So that is it's a value. The community voted their value and they are addressing aggressively sea level rise and many other things. But thinking about long-term capital that has the ability to reduce the risks, the rating agencies understand that, and none of this is perfect. And I go back to Billy's comment about institutions. You know, there's a little bit of a dichotomy here. Institutions are born out of this chaos, but at the same time, and of course, coming from the Atlantic Council, we're defending democracy and shoring up democratic institutions. If you look at the trends, and the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, Mr. Haas, I think his name is, he's got a new book that says, I don't think we're looking at international collaboration. I think we're looking at countries turning inward. And so I wanted to get back to cities on the front line as, you know, bootstrapping it. They have no choice but to respond to what their citizens need. And so I think getting savvy and combining needs for capital with other cities, these networks that exist are fantastic. Risk pools that have shown to be really successful. One in particular in the Caribbean that's got a dozen years of experience behind it that has lots of potential to do some of the most sophisticated management of risk, but reducing risks. And I think, you know, when you think about the definition of risk or the formula, it's the hazard times the vulnerability times the exposure. And so where in that formula can you make the difference? And I think it's the vulnerability. It's hard to, we have to get back to decarbonization to talk about the exposure. But anyway, I think creativity, and there's not a lack of capital. I think joining together with other cities and prioritizing and keeping the ability to be nimble with your funding. I think thinking about resilience funds that respond to the various crises and making sure that the solutions are multi-benefit, because you think about public health and climate and biodiversity loss, all of them pointing to this way that we're living. We know we can't continue to do. I think there's some efficiencies to be achieved in that approach.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Michael, I'd like to invite you back here. I know you've been diligently monitoring the audience Q&A, so if you want to pop up in New City spirit.
Thank you very much, Greg. So we've got a question here. Our top ranked question, which has also been reiterated a bit in the chat, is how can cities or local governments implement decarbonization at a neighborhood level so that citizens become more involved? Charles-Edouard, let's start with you, then go to Billy, and then to Kathy.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. So indeed, I think I spoke a bit about the concept of prosumer, which is how for, let's say, citizens to be part of the production and therefore management of energies. This is always a key topic, and it's part of the local governance that we always have to deal with when we speak about cities topics, and not only about energy. I would say again that the solutions exist, including some digital apps or digital tools in order to create this dialogue or interaction between end users, citizens, public authorities, and private operators. Of course, the situation is very different from one geography to another. And I think that it's always a question of, again, I would say dialogue, interaction, to humility also, to listen to, not only to say, as I as public or I as private, I have the solution. No, nobody has a solution, or everyone or everybody has a solution. It's always a question of listening to people. The technology helps in that. What is a bit, I would say, tricky is the fact that sometimes the technology is coming even from new actors, new players of the city's ecosystem. I'm speaking, for instance, about the GAFAs, which are not the guys coming from energy. Neither they are pure telecom operators. For sure, they are not public bodies, either local or national at national scale, but they are the experts in order to provide some digital apps or digital solutions to let people discuss each other, interact, provide new services. So I think it's also a key question in this kind of session to discuss about this kind of new players. As far as energy is concerned, we clearly see everywhere in the world the fact to listen to people, to interact with people, not only with a bill, but I would say in order to ask for actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all right. And I would add, too, that to point us back to the New Deal for a second, because I think it's often sort of mythologized as this, massive centralized undertaking where all of the levers and knobs of government were sort of operated by FDR and his administration. And for some things, that's true. But for most of the things that we're talking about here, the sort of built and natural environment, the infrastructure investments that really this question is sort of pulling us towards, it didn't work that way at all. It was mostly about collecting huge sums of federal money and then transferring it to state and local governments and formulating partnerships through state and local government with NGOs to implement and develop all of the projects. So, there wasn't someone in a bunker room at HUD, designing a plan for the sanitary sewer system of Omaha, Nebraska. Someone in Omaha was doing that and then building it. And it's going to have to work that way for us too. And I think that one of the lessons we can take from the New Deal forward into both like the stimulus response and into hopefully like the next decade of really serious climate investment and action is how we can think about those huge sums of money as a tool for restructuring power. Because often what we found in the New Deal is that there was no restructuring. It was just reification of power that existed on the ground at the moment. It's why a lot of the New Deal sort of investments in the South serve to sort of extend the legacy of the Jim Crow South further than it might have lasted otherwise, and certainly entrenched it deeper than it would have been possible without the New Deal. The political coalition that made the New Deal possible was part of why that happened. And so as we think about channeling big national scale investments into local communities, whether it's at like the city scale, the neighborhood scale, the homeowner or person scale, we have to think about who those players are that we would want to empower, and also who we would want to disempower in this, because there are, I would love to say everyone involved in like the development of cities are great and like they're all my friends, but they're not. There are some real enemies in this, and we have to think about how we take them out of position to control the distribution of these funds, and how we empower new groups to sort of govern the implementation of the places where they live and work.
Thank you, Billy. Another question, Michael, please.
Got a question here from Mike. So it seems that everyone concurs that the challenges are largely political and financial, not technical. So what are some of the examples of great educational efforts that have changed the public and government mindset to support resiliency and climate action initiatives?
Kathy,
let's start with Kathy first, maybe, or Greg, do you want to get a word?
Kathy, if you could take that one, because I know that's one of the projects that Arts Rockefeller is working on there, with stories of resilience and some of your other sort of like soft cultural outreach on, helping people grow resilience.
Yes, I would say when you think about one aspect, and I think it's been elevated through the response of COVID-19, not just to the health, but to the economic response, is the role of social cohesion and the social fabric of a community. And that has played a big role in response right at the community level. And secondly, you're right, Mike, it's not a capital problem, political will. And I think in a moment ago, we said, the political will is there. I'm not so sure. I think we've got some challenges there, but we could come back to that. And it's not a technology problem, got that. But there are immense and multiple strategies, solutions, evidence-based interventions that communities can take on themselves. You know, we're focused on climate adaptation, we're focused on reducing vulnerabilities to public health, and we're working also on migration, which we haven't quite touched on, but I think that's something, when you think about cities and you think about where we're headed, we need to think about extreme heat and the effects that it has on all populations. But in terms of local communities and local jurisdictions taking on education, and I've seen the Red Cross has been phenomenal at building apps. And one thing I'll share is that we're working with the gaming industry to build a video game with the leaders in the gaming industry. I won't drop names, but big names that you all would recognize. And we think we can reach 300 million people with a climate survival game and with our content and other people's games, because that's where people are. And so I'll leave it there. I want to give time for others, but lots of things to be done, lots of things happening, lots of evidence that they work, and bottom up is the way to go.
Billy, can I hear your quick response to this question too? Because you mentioned that the data and statistics have not been good at sort of changing elite preferences in this. So I'm curious to know if you have any particular takes. I mean, there are charismatic politicians, of course, like Bernie and AOC on the left arguing for this. But how do you drive change in this particular instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are lots of different theories of change for this, but I tend to come down on the side that, elected officials will do what they are forced to do and little else. There's a lot of sort of romanticizing the 1970s in the US in terms of environmental action. People often try to point to Richard Nixon as like some kind of a quiet environmentalist in the Republican-controlled Senate and the House during that period, while they were Democratic in the House, as sort of quiet environmentalists. And I think the sort of historical record sort of disproves that pretty readily, that they were forced to sign things into law because they were brought to their knees by an environmental movement that had gained power throughout the 1960s and crushed them in the 1970s, forcing Nixon et al. To sign a bunch of things they didn't want to sign. It's going to work that way again. There's not going to be a sort of benevolent mayor who comes to office and says, or governor who comes to office and says, like, the political will be damned, I'm going to do a bunch of climate stuff that no one's asking for. They're going to do the things that are demanded and that they feel like they cannot sustain power without doing. And so this is a question for movement building outside of government about how to exercise power in different ways. So if we look at, again, like 2009 and how weak the progressive left in the US was, and really around much of the world, it's part of why we found ourselves with, in Europe, a bunch of austerity measures post-crisis, and in the US, a very undersized stimulus measure to respond to the crisis. The left in the US, at least, is much, much stronger than it was then. And came within kind of a whisker of winning a presidential primary only a few years after it took electoral politics seriously for the first time in a half century. And so we will get to a point again where we can do those kinds of things. Whether it's in a year, 2 years, 5 years, I think is to be determined. But I think I'm looking more at like what the demands and the pressure and the mobilization outside of the public sector looks like, rather than who I think might be, sort of winning elected office, who sort of points towards the things we say we want, but won't actually take them on without sustained outside pressure.
Thank you. I want to interject with a question here, which touches upon, there's an anonymous one up here about sort of bringing up the global South again, and particularly sort of nations that do not have the financial resources of the global North. We've had a very global North conversation. So I guess start by framing, I'd like to go to Charles Edouard in the sense of, how can we change the paradigm for energy generation and decarbonization in the global South? There's a lot said about leapfrog technologies, about quickly transitioning large swaths of the global South to solar and microgrids, et cetera. I'm curious if you have any interesting examples or inspiring examples of how that is proceeding. And then I want to come back to the question as Kathy raised and Billy as well about climate migration, and particularly dwelling with the sort of larger issues, particularly as people afraid of cities will leave cities and perhaps to other domains. But Charles Edouard, first, in the Global South, what are some inspiring projects of how we can change the paradigm about how we create energy?
So I think you mentioned the key word for me. It's not smart grids, as we are always speaking about, let's say in the North, and from smart grids to smart city, etc. It's really to think about a very decentralized management of energy, and in most of the cases what we need is electricity, what we have seen also sometimes in some specific area is the need for electricity is also coming from the need of telecommunication. I need to charge my phone, so I need electricity. And therefore, what we see is again a question of technology on the one hand, because it's not so easy to produce a local and green energy. Sometimes where we produce a local energy, the energy is coming from oil. And even today, when we speak about microgrids, we are always speaking about hybrid microgrids, which means a combination of oil and another kind of energy, which in most of the cases is coming from solar panels. And then the question of storage and etc. So, and I don't want to go back to technology, but microgrids are really getting developed a bit everywhere. The quick question is about how for local people to benefit from a technology or a development which is being done. And therefore we are speaking about education in a way, or training, and also about financing. And financing, in what we can see, Billy spoke about NGOs. We always see, I would say maybe not always, but more and more at least, the EFIs, the International Financing Institutions, sorry. So the World Bank and the equivalent Asian Development Bank and so on and so forth, going to this more decentralized scale, not only centralized, but decentralized. And of course, we also have to mention about the other business model about the local and microfinancing. And this is, I think, a key question is about first technology, second, the technology which is respecting the planet, financing, and social acceptance / training and education. But the projects are existing and booming a bit everywhere. So this is not an issue. The question is how to really have a green energy when it's produced locally.
Thank you. And then Kathy, if you could take this as well. A few weeks ago we had on the Big Rethink, we had a whole discussion about megacities and density and the Indian lockdown, for example, over 1 billion people, which sort of, basically trapped people in migratory flows. So now in India, there's a massive migration back. Another dress rehearsal for what could and will likely happen during climate change of large-scale population movement. I'm curious how your work addresses this too. I know that your center is doing work in Venezuela, for example, which is a combination geopolitics, climate change, human rights issue, all wrapped up into one, and mass migration to Colombia.
Yeah, and we think about migration is not a bad thing, and we want to combat a lot of the xenophobia that's rising around COVID-19 in particular. I mean, all existed there, but this rise of nationalism, and it all goes together. And so they're particularly vulnerable, but and climate is overtaken as the main driver for forced migration. It was conflict and now it's climate. And so, we think about people in those situations in 3 stages. They're getting them out of crisis to stability to prosperity. And what does it take to do that? What are the, there's philanthropy, of course, involved, and there's government. There's a role for government, but there's also microfinance for women and focusing on jobs and focusing on their economic livelihoods. In terms of the Indian crisis, it's sobering. I've tried to think of the right word. I mean, the number of people that are trapped, and they're it's a humanitarian crisis, and we see them all around the world. But we're working with our partners in India to help, particularly the kids that get trapped with their parents. There's been some easing lately, but it's not a simple solution. But it starts with how do we get people out of crisis and reconnected with their families and the documents that they need to prove identity and that sort of thing. It's basic and growing in its magnitude, but there are all sorts of solutions and evidence again of how we can do it well. And so I'll stop there. Thanks for bringing this into the conversation.
Thank you, Kathy. Michael, I think we have time for one more question if we can get everyone involved. Lightning round time? Great.
I think we have enough time. Let's just go. So our last top question is from Samir, and it's talking about public transport, which is one of the key services that we talk about for reducing carbon emissions. So how can governments ensure the efficient functioning of public transport, and particularly what could be the incentives to the operators?
a little granular. Anyone want to take that? Billy, you want to take a shot at this? I mean,
sure. Yeah, this is a great question because I think this is a question that local transit agencies, really in every country with public transportation, are sort of grappling with. There are a couple things. One is just to recognize that like normal operations are years away, not weeks or months. And so one of the things that has to happen is that operating assistance has to be a part of every single stimulus, bailout, recovery bill that passes for that foreseeable future. We could even imagine into 2022, 23, say things are relatively back to normal in terms of people sort of working. It's still going to mean that lots of folks are probably afraid to take public transportation. And so ridership rates are going to be down, and it's just going to require a larger subsidy for the foreseeable future. And, legislative bodies are going to have to start factoring that into all of the ways that they think about appropriating money for, most of the early 2020s. The other is that we're also going to have to think, I think, seriously about redesigning some of the cars. I mean, I'm talking about like retrofitting. So one of those is going to be about probably knocking out the sort of human capacity. So putting in some buffer space so they aren't quite as packed as they would have been in other places. There's going to require probably an investment in more maintenance and upkeep to clean them all the time, not just like once a week or once a day, but probably frequently throughout the day, providing in car or in station, hand sanitizer and other things that sound like really, they're not high speed rail. They're not maglev trains. They're not like the sexy projects that transportation people like to float, but they're the really important ones to make sure that we can restore confidence in our transportation systems. But in the meantime, we have to recognize that they're not like a switch we can flip on and off so that when we don't need them, like we can just let them wither. And when we do, they'll just magically reappear. We have to keep paying for them to exist, even if it just means keeping people on payroll who aren't driving, cars or buses or trains at all, or maybe they're driving far fewer of them, so that when the time comes for us to be able to return to work, public transportation is still there in the form that we need it to be.
Thank you. I would have time for one last lightning round question. If anyone wants to tackle this, there's an anonymous question in the Q&A about, and I raised the specter of this at the very top. We've seen carbon emissions drop 17% at tremendous cost to the economy by locking it down. But is there a real possibility of this opportunity being a moment to advance degrowth? And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, degrowth is the idea of, effectively unshackling ourselves and the economy from GDP and permanent 3% economic growth towards a more circular economy and other sort of values from there. And I'm curious, there seems to be a very strong sentiment of people who want to go back to normal, whatever normal means. But I'm curious about whether we could see a potential cultural shift as well, and not just simply decarbonizing our economy for growth, but changing that entire thing. I suspect Billy has some thoughts on this, but Kathy or Charles Edouard, if you have thoughts as well, I'd love to hear them.
Charles Edouard, do you want to go? I have a few thoughts.
Please, Kathy.
Use the floor.
Okay. I think I want to focus on food for just a minute as one aspect of that, and the need for people to have, and when you think about COVID-19, a shorter supply chain for your food, and the growth in the CSAs that you're seeing in the US, and this is of course in the developed world. And there's a conversation to be had, of course, for the developing economies and those cities, but I think the answer is flat yes. And the idea that we would go back, I think, is a bit of a fantasy. There's only one way, and that's forward, and it looks different, and it's never going to be what it was before. And so, and I think as we go through this experience, as individuals, as professionals in this field, every week is different. We couldn't have foreseen what it would feel like to be on Zoom for 10 hours a day, and how draining that was, and the psychological effects of being physically away from friends and family. So we're learning so much in this. We will never be the same. And I think that means that the way we live and the way we invest, and I think even the social license to operate environment shifts. The enabling environment for a lot of the things we're talking about has shifted. And I'll come back to food to say that's one of the things we really need to think about, and that is how do we shorten that supply chain? And I think we're going to see pocket gardens, rooftop gardens, and CSAs, and a real go back to where I know my food came from, less meat, all sorts of stuff. So I'll stop there, but we're never going back.
Thank you, Kathy. Billy, I'll give you the last word if you want to take it, but hard to talk about.
Yeah, well, Kathy's exactly right. I would just add to that maybe that the other ways in which we will not be going back to normal is that our economy is being restructured, and really the choice now is about the form and content, not about like whether or not like everything is going to be different when we sort of get out of this particular circumstance. We're going to see like entirely new constituencies for the things that have been shamefully underfunded for a very long time, including public schools, public parks, civic infrastructure, sidewalks, unsexy projects like street and sewer repair, clearing backlogs of like ADA compliance project, clearing backlogs of public lands, restoration, upgrade projects. And so we have an obligation to try and lock in, I think, those constituencies by channeling our investment in the first or second waves of stimulus into building those kinds of projects that put lots of people back to work who have lost jobs that will never return, and in repairing and restoring the communities where they live, so that they are able to enjoy the sort of spoils of this recovery in a way that was not possible or was not made possible in 2009.
Thank you, Billy. And for those of you wondering what his virtual backdrop is, that is the day that oil futures went to negative $36 a barrel. So for those of you enjoying the stonks meme. I'd like to thank Kathy, Charles Edouard, and Billy, our panelists. A round of virtual applause for all three of you. Thank you so much. Michael, we have a little bit of housekeeping on the way out here. If we can bring back up the screen. Yes, next week is our final episode of the 8-week run of the Big Rethink, Lessons for Greenfield Mega Projects. So, as many of you have heard, more than half of humanity lives in cities. There is this, tidal wave of urbanization that continues even once COVID-19 ends, at least in this first wave, perhaps, and a vaccine is hopefully found. And so basically lessons of, what have we learned? Because, we're seeing lots of discussions around the world about how do we, COVID-proof our cities. So it'll be interesting. We'll talk to a few people who are actually working on that and thinking about how do we unfold the lessons of this into their urban designs. The people who actually do have a bit of hindsight on their side. So with that, we hope you'll tune in next week for the next episode of the Big Rethink. And thank you all again for coming. I know you have to jump on your next calls, and thank you all again to our guests.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Edouard.
Bye.
Bye.
Lovely to see y'all.
Enchanté. Au revoir.
Enchanté.
Enchanté.